The metal rod caught me just below the kneecap before I even saw him cross the room, the whole motion happening faster than my mind could properly track. 1 second I was standing near the string light strung across my parents' backyard, watching Sophia's face crumple in slow, devastating stages as she processed what I'd just told her. And the next second, white-hot pain exploded up my leg with a force that seemed to swallow every other sensation whole, and I was on the ground, my knee bent at an angle knees were never designed to bend, the grass cool and damp beneath my cheek where I'd fallen sideways without even registering the fall itself. I'd found Sophia by the drinks table maybe 10 minutes earlier, both of us reaching for the same bottle of Prosecco, and I remember, even now, replaying the decision I made in that moment, whether to say anything at all, whether this was my business to interfere in, whether Marcus's happiness, however built on a lie, was worth protecting even at Sophia's expense. I'd carried the knowledge for 3 weeks by then, ever since I'd run into Priya entirely by accident at a conference 2 states away, recognized her instantly from a photo I'd once seen years earlier tucked into Marcus's wallet before he'd apparently decided that particular chapter of his life no longer needed acknowledging. She told me everything over an awkward, halting conversation in a hotel lobby. The marriage, the separation that had never been formalized into an actual divorce, the fact that Marcus had simply stopped returning her calls 18 months earlier and she'd assumed, reasonably, that some paperwork somewhere had quietly resolved things in the time since. I'd told Sophia gently, or as gently as information like that can ever be delivered, pulling her aside near the hedge line where the party noise wouldn't carry our conversation to anyone else. I watched her face do something complicated and terrible, disbelief giving way slowly to a kind of dawning, sick recognition as she started connecting details I hadn't even mentioned. A business trip Marcus took twice a year to the same city, always vague about the purpose, a credit card statement she'd once glimpsed with a hotel charge she'd never thought to question. "You're sure?" She kept saying, not really a question anymore by the 3rd time she said it, and I was still nodding, still trying to find some way to soften a fact that had no soft version, when Marcus appeared behind us with the metal rod already in his hand. He'd been using it earlier that afternoon to prop open the shed door while he hauled out extra folding chairs for the party, a length of rusted rebar he'd apparently just set down somewhere nearby rather than putting it away properly, and in the time it took Sophia's expression to shift from confusion to horror, he must have crossed the yard, grabbed it up again, and closed the distance between us without either of us noticing anything except each other. "You had to open your mouth," Marcus was screaming, the rod still gripped tight in his fist, his face contorted into something I'd genuinely never seen on him before in 29 years of being his sister, not even during the worst of our childhood fights. "You couldn't just let me have this. You've never once let me have anything." I heard my mother laugh before I registered much else through the pain, that same sharp, delighted sound she'd made throughout my entire childhood whenever I fell off my bike, whenever I struck out at softball games she'd only reluctantly attended, whenever the universe handed me something humiliating to sit inside of instead of Marcus. She was standing near the drinks table where Sophia and I had been just minutes earlier, a glass of white wine still in her hand, condensation running down the stem, and she was actually laughing, an easy, genuine sound carrying clean across 40 guests now frozen mid-conversation, watching her son shatter her daughter's kneecap with a metal rod in front of an engagement party that had, in the space of about 90 seconds, become something else entirely. She's always been jealous of him, my mother said to no one in particular, though loud enough that it clearly reached every corner of the yard, her tone almost conversational, almost bored, the tone of someone narrating an old, familiar family dynamic rather than witnessing an assault. Couldn't stand to see him happy. She's done this her whole life. I want to say I processed the strangeness of that sentence in the moment, the sheer, impossible detachment required to watch your son break your daughter's leg and respond with an explanation for why your daughter deserved it. But the truth is the pain had already narrowed my entire awareness down to a single, blinding tunnel, my own breathing coming in short, ragged gasps that didn't seem to be pulling in enough air no matter how hard I tried. I remember catching flashes of the party around me through that tunnel, someone's phone raised, recording, a teenage cousin frozen with a plate of appetizers still in his hand, My father standing near the grill with tongs dangling loose from his fingers, his expression unreadable, his feet planted exactly where they'd been before any of this started, not moving toward me, not moving toward Marcus, simply watching. Sophia was the one who moved. She dropped to her knees on the grass beside me almost instantly, her engagement dress, pale blue, chosen weeks earlier for an occasion that no longer existed in any recognizable form, soaking up moisture and grass stains she'd never fully get out, her hands shaking badly as she pulled her phone from her small clutch purse and dialed 911 with fingers that kept slipping on the screen. Her face was streaked with tears now for entirely different reasons than the ones that had started 30 seconds earlier by the hedge line, and I remember, even through the pain, feeling a strange, disconnected gratitude that at least one person in that yard seemed to understand what had actually just happened. "Stay still," she kept saying, her voice cracking, one hand hovering uselessly over my leg, clearly terrified to touch it and make anything worse. "Help is coming, just stay still, I've got you." Nobody else in my family moved toward me at all. Marcus had backed away by then. The rod finally dropped somewhere in the grass, his hands coming up to cover his own face, as though he'd only just, belatedly, registered what he'd done, though I noticed even then that his horror seemed aimed entirely inward, some private reckoning with his own actions rather than any concern for the leg he'd just destroyed. My mother remained by the drinks table, her laughter fading into something more watchful now, assessing, the way she might watch a scene unfold on television rather than something happening 8 feet in front of her involving her own children. My father stood by the grill the entire time, tongs still in hand, watching with an expression I couldn't read and, honestly, didn't have the capacity to try reading, my vision narrowing further and further into a tunnel of white-hot pain radiating up from where my kneecap no longer sat anywhere close to where it was supposed to. The paramedics arrived 12 minutes later, according to the dispatch log Sophia would later show me on her phone, though it felt considerably longer lying there on the grass with the party's string lights blurring overhead and Sophia's voice the only steady, anchoring thing cutting through the pain. "They had to sedate me almost immediately," one paramedic explaining quickly, clinically, to his partner that the fracture pattern looked severe enough that straightening the leg even slightly for transport risked further damage, without something to blunt the pain first. I remember the prick of the needle, and I remember, just before the sedation pulled me under, one last clear image of my mother, still standing by the drinks table with her wine glass, watching the paramedics work with an expression that had finally settled into something like irritation, as though the whole ordeal were simply an inconvenient interruption to an otherwise pleasant evening she'd been looking forward to. I woke up in recovery hours later, groggy and nauseous from the anesthesia, my mouth dry, and my thoughts moving through a thick, syrupy fog that made it difficult to string together anything resembling a coherent memory of what had happened before the sedation took hold. The ceiling above me was unfamiliar, fluorescent and flat, and for a disoriented moment I genuinely couldn't remember why my leg felt so strange, elevated and immobilized in some kind of brace, before the memory arrived all at once, sharp and complete, the rod, the sound, my mother's laugh carrying across the yard. It was Sophia sitting beside my bed, not anyone in my actual family, still wearing the pale blue engagement dress now stained dark along the knees with dried grass and dirt, her hair coming loose from whatever careful arrangement she'd had it in that morning. She looked exhausted in a way that seemed to go beyond the hours she'd clearly spent waiting through my surgery, some deeper exhaustion settling into her features, the particular fatigue of someone whose entire understanding of her own life had been dismantled and rebuilt within the same afternoon. "I called your mom," she told me quietly, her voice still a little raw. "She said you'd probably provoked him." I asked her, my own voice slurred and thick, what that meant exactly, provoked him, as though there existed some version of telling the truth about a hidden marriage that could reasonably be classified as provocation deserving of a shattered kneecap. Sophia just shook her head slowly, her jaw tight, and told me she'd hung up the phone after that she hadn't trusted herself to say anything else to my mother without saying something she couldn't take back. I spent 11 days in the hospital altogether, the first several blurred together by pain medication and the disorienting rhythm of hospital routines, Vitals checked every few hours, physical therapists stopping by even before I was fully ready to engage with the reality of what recovery would actually require. The surgeon, a calm, precise woman named Dr. Whitfield, explained the extent of the damage to me on the third day with the kind of careful, measured language doctors use when they want you to understand something is serious without triggering outright panic. A comminuted patellar fracture. The kneecap shattered into multiple fragments rather than the cleaner break she said she sometimes saw in similar injuries, requiring open reduction and internal fixation, a titanium plate, and 6 screws now, holding together what remained of my own bone. She told me, gently, that I should expect a long recovery, months rather than weeks, and that even with the best possible healing, I would likely never regain full range of motion in that knee, that some permanent stiffness and a reduced tolerance for activities like running or kneeling was simply going to be part of my life going forward. My mother visited exactly once during those 11 days, on the third day, arriving without calling first, without flowers, without anything resembling the gestures people typically bring to a hospital room. She stood at the foot of my bed with her arms crossed over her chest, still in the same cardigan I remembered her wearing at the party, and informed me, in a tone that suggested she was doing me a favor simply by showing up at all, that Marcus was devastated about what he'd done, that Sophia had officially called off the engagement, and that all of it, the broken engagement, Marcus's devastation, my own shattered kneecap, was fundamentally my fault for meddling in something that wasn't my business, as though the existence of a hidden, undissolved marriage were somehow a private detail I had no standing to reveal rather than a fact that directly and materially concerned the woman about to legally bind her life to his. I asked her, my voice still thick and unsteady from the pain medication working through my system, whether she'd known Marcus was already married when she watched him get down on one knee in front of Sophia 6 months earlier at a restaurant she'd helped him choose specifically for the occasion, when she'd spent the following months helping plan an engagement party for a wedding that could never, under any legal circumstance, actually take place. She didn't answer the question directly. She glanced toward the window instead, her jaw working slightly, a tell I recognized from childhood as the specific look she got right before deciding not to say something true. Then she picked up her purse from the visitor's chair and told me she needed to get back, that Marcus needed her more right now than I did, needed support, needed someone in his corner while he processed the mess that had unfolded. I asked her, before she reached the door, whether Marcus had been charged with anything, whether the police who'd taken statements from Sophia and several other guests at the party had followed up with any actual consequences. He's not a criminal, my mother said sharply, turning back toward me with something close to genuine anger flashing across her face for the first time since she'd walked in. He made a mistake in the heat of the moment. You have no idea what that's like, do you? Always so calm, always so composed, always so quick to judge everyone else. She left without saying goodbye, and I lay there afterward staring at the ceiling for a long time, understanding, with a clarity that the pain medication somehow made sharper rather than duller, that this had always been true, in every version of our family that had ever existed. Marcus's mistakes were context to be understood, weighed, forgiven. Mine were character flaws to be catalogued. Marcus was, in fact, eventually charged, though not until nearly 3 weeks later, once the district attorney's office had finished reviewing the statements collected at the party, including the cell phone footage a cousin had captured on instinct in the moments before the rod actually connected with my leg, footage that showed clearly, unambiguously, that this hadn't been some chaotic, mutual altercation but a single, deliberate act carried out by one person against another who hadn't moved to defend herself at all. He was charged with aggravated assault, a felony given the severity and permanence of the injury, and the case moved slowly through the system over the following 10 months while I worked through 6 weeks in a wheelchair and then gradually, painfully, for more months of physical therapy in a small clinic near my apartment, relearning how to bend a joint that would never again function the way it had before that afternoon in my parents' backyard. Sophia and I stayed close throughout that entire process, an unexpected friendship forged in the wreckage of what should have been the worst possible circumstances for one to form. She drove me to several physical therapy appointments during the weeks I couldn't manage stairs on my own, sat with me through the long, tedious hours of range of motion exercises, and testified, eventually at Marcus's trial, describing exactly what she'd witnessed from the moment I'd pulled her aside near the hedge line to the moment paramedics loaded me into the ambulance. Her testimony, combined with the cell phone footage and my own account once I was well enough to give it clearly, left very little room for Marcus's attorney to construct any version of events that painted this as anything other than exactly what it was. He was convicted and sentenced to 4 years, a number that felt, to me, both appropriate for the severity of what he'd done and somehow smaller than the permanent, daily reality of a knee that still, years later, aches predictably before rain, that still can't fully kneel, that still occasionally buckles without warning on uneven ground in a way that has cost me 2 falls since the surgery, and a persistent, low-grade wariness about stairs I never used to think twice about. My mother attended every single day of his trial. She never once came to check on my recovery during that same period, never called to ask how the physical therapy was progressing, never acknowledged, even obliquely, that her own daughter was rebuilding a body that her son had permanently altered. My father, for his part, sent a single card about 2 months after the injury, generic, store-bought, a stock message about wishing me a speedy recovery with his name signed at the bottom in handwriting I barely recognized as his. No visit. No phone call. I understood, reading it, that this was likely the full extent of what he was capable of offering, a man who had stood by a grill with tongs in his hand while his daughter's leg was destroyed 20 feet away and hadn't moved, and who apparently saw no contradiction in sending a card afterward, as though that settled some obligation. I don't speak to my parents now, not in any regular way, beyond the occasional obligatory holiday text that I've mostly stopped responding to over the past 2 years. My relationship with Marcus ended entirely the day of the assault, and I've made no effort to reconnect since his release, informed secondhand through a cousin that he's moved to another state and, as far as anyone in the wider family knows, quietly divorced Priya at last, several years and 1 felony conviction too late for it to matter to anyone but himself. Sophia and I still talk most weeks, our friendship having settled into something steady and genuine that neither of us anticipated on the day we met over a shared reach for a Prosecco bottle. She tells me sometimes that she still can't quite believe how close she came to marrying a man capable of what Marcus did, how grateful she remains, even now, that I said something at all despite knowing, on some level, how badly it might go. I tell her, honestly, that I don't think about the decision as brave, not really just necessary, the kind of thing you do because the alternative, watching someone walk into a marriage built on a lie you could have stopped, felt unthinkable at the time, whatever the personal cost turned out to be. My knee still aches before rain, a dull, persistent ache that settles into the joint like clockwork whenever the barometric pressure shifts, an unwelcome but reliable weather forecast embedded permanently in my own body. I've stopped resenting it, mostly. It reminds me, in its own strange way, of exactly what my family is capable of when the truth becomes inconvenient enough, and exactly how little that truth ever seemed to matter to the people who were supposed to protect me from it in the first place.